The Casser-Jayne Show airs Wednesdays, 3 p.m. Eastern. The podcast's always available online at Casser-Jayne.com. You paint with words, but you're also a painter. I thought I'd mention that and ask if that helps your writing. And do you, in the throes of writing, sometimes scream out, "I'd rather be painting"?
Well, there's usually one little sort of surface in the many work spaces in my apartment where there is a paintbrush and there is paper to paint. So I just turn to that sometimes instead of vacuuming.
I can relate. Instead of vacuuming. Ah, that's Susan Minot. What a personality. And what a fascinating lady, as are the characters in her latest novel, 30 Girls. You are about to meet the very special award-winning author, Susan Minot, in a moment when she joins me at my table here on the Casser-Jayne Show. Hi, and welcome. I am Casser-Jayne. But before we begin, today, the Casser-Jayne Show is brought to you by Audible.com, a leading provider of spoken audio information and entertainment. Get a free audiobook and 30-day trial today by signing up at www.audibletrial.com/The Casser-Jayne Show. And remember, the Casser-Jayne Show is always available online at HalleyCasserJayne.com and a host of venues, including Stitcher.com, Spreaker.com, TuneIn Radio, iTunes, Blog Talk Radio, and on the iHeartRadio network. Susan Minot is an award-winning novelist, short story writer, poet, and screenwriter. Her first novel, Monkeys, was published in 12 countries and won the Prix Féminine Étrangère in France. She went on to write Evening and Lust and other stories. Minot also writes nonfiction, screenplays, and teaches writing. In her book, 30 Girls, her first work of fiction in 10 years, Minot tells the story of Esther, a Ugandan teenager abducted by the Lord's Resistance Army and forced to witness and commit unspeakable atrocities, who is struggling to survive, to escape, and to find a way to live with what she has seen and done. And Jane, an American journalist who has traveled to Africa hoping to give a voice to children like Esther and to find her center after a series of failed relationships. In her characteristic, unflinching prose, Minot interweaves their stories, giving us razor-sharp portraits of two extraordinary young women confronting displacement, heartbreak, and the struggle to wrest meaning from events that test them both in unimaginable ways. Let's talk. So 30 Girls is based on a true story and real people. How'd you get drawn into the story of Joseph Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army, the kidnapping of a group of girls and the nun who tried to save them? Talk to me.
Well, I went to a dinner party in New York City, and there was a woman there who was a guest from Uganda, and there were some people from Human Rights Watch that was having their banquet the next day, and this woman was being honored the next day. So at the small group, a sort of more intimate gathering, she told the story of a group of girls in a boarding school in northern Uganda who were kidnapped by this sort of roaming rebel bandit group and led out into the bush. And one of the teachers of the school, an Italian nun, decided to go out after them and bring the girls back. And she did catch up with the group the next day at about noon and had tea with the commander, who sort of accepted her, and they prayed with their rosaries together, and she said, "Give me back my girls." And he said, "Well, I've got 139 of them." And he wrote down in the dirt, "And I'll give you 109, but I'm keeping," and he wrote 30. And she said, no, keep me, leave them. And he said, "You do like this, or you have none of them." So she led them away, and the 30 girls remained. So at the dinner party, someone said to this woman, whose name was Angelina Item, Do we know about this? In other words, no, we don't know about the Lord's Resistance Army and that it had been terrorizing the north of Uganda for some 8 years at that time and went on for another 12 years. And someone else said, and what is your connection here? And she said, my daughter is one of those 30 girls.
Oh, God. Aye.
And I had been spending some time in Eastern Africa. I had a trip planned in another month. And I was so moved by this story. I mean, it was really, I think it was the personal delivery of the story from this woman who was here trying to gather attention to the plight not only of her daughter but of all these children who are being victimized and enslaved. And I thought, well, maybe I can write something about it. It's not my usual beat. It's more an investigative or a international kind of reporter thing to do. But I thought, well, maybe I can write about it in my way. And I went over there. This is in 1998. And I did indeed write a nonfiction piece that eventually was in McSweeney's magazine. And I'd been writing it really with in a way that I don't usually write my fiction, which is I write a book and whoever reads it, they read it, and I don't feel I need to make them read it, but if they do, then that's nice. But I did want people to read this, and I did want some response, and I heard nothing.
Really?
It's safe to say no one said a peep about it.
Well, what? That's crazy.
Well, people hear these things and they don't know what to do, and they feel like Africa is this sort of confusing place and they can't keep the country straight and terrible things seem to be happening there all the time because, of course, that's the news that we get. We hear terrible things. And so I was disappointed, but I thought, well, I guess that's what happens, or how do you get people to do something, and life intervened, and I moved to an island in Maine, and I got married, and I had a child, and 8 years later, when I was sitting down to start on a novel, I'd been doing other things in the meantime, I had a few ideas, but these girls, the story of these girls was just floating closer in front of my face with much more kind of intensity than the other stories I had. And I thought, well, maybe I'm not done with this story. I haven't, and I did feel like, these girls the girls I had spoken to when I was there had entrusted a very, intense and emotional story of what they had been through to me. And I felt sort of a custodian of that. And I thought, well, they're not telling their own story. Let me try. So I thought I would try to tell it from the inside out.
And that's why you chose fiction, I assume, because you felt that you could do that in a better job.
Exactly.
Yeah. And maybe even make it something that people could relate to when they don't relate to news.
It's a little harder to relate sometimes to the nonfiction thing. So I thought if you just to try to make it to feel as close to this experience as possible, I ended up taking out a lot more about Uganda and the tribal history that sort of allowed for Joseph Kony to sort of emerge. And then I realized, no, that's not what this is about. This is about what's going on inside these people.
Right, absolutely. Just to get it straight, so for people who may not really know, I just want to give them a quick one. Mm-hmm. Joseph Kony, Lord's Liberation Army, wacky man. Lord's Resistance. What I say, Liberation. Yeah. I was just doing Patty Hearst.
Doesn't even matter. It's a complete misnomer.
Exactly,
anyway.
Absolutely.
He's just a hoodlum.
Exactly, a madman, to be specific. And he built this army on kidnapping children, basically.
Yes.
So I think that's something that we probably ought to get out there a little bit. But now getting back to you, because this is fascinating to me, because knowing your work and knowing how you work, this thing's percolating in your head and your heart before you even sit down to write. Did you envision it would turn out to be what you wound up writing?
No, because it evolved over the 7 years I was writing it. Initially, it was going to be, I was just going to focus on these girls and their stories, and I was going to tell 3 different stories of how, not so much the horrible things that they had gone through, because a little of that goes a long way. You know, that's not something to really be explored. It's a thing that everyone can take in quickly and easily, and we know it's horrible. But the interesting thing, or the thing that can be explored, is how people manage when they've been through trauma. Mm-hmm. And because not everyone does, and people deal with it in different ways. And because there are tens of thousands of these children who survived the enslavement with the LRA, they still have another challenge, which is to live with what they went through and what they were put through, what they were made to do, kill other children, you know, horrible things.
Envision the worst. And then that's only 1/3 of what these kids have been through, and their families, by the way, as well. Talk to me about you, though, first. Let's digress for a second. Let's talk about Susan. Born in Boston, Massachusetts, grew up in, I love this, Manchester by the Sea. I love that. Mm-hmm. That's a great romantic
Well, not to be confused with Manchester, New Hampshire.
Yeah, right. I got that. A girl from a large, Catholic family, I think, educated at Brown and Columbia. I got to ask you this question, kiddo. What in the childhood of yours prepared you to become the kind of writer that you are today, notorious for being honest, for so dissecting, for being so fearless? Talk to me.
Well, I wouldn't have characterized myself that way.
That's true.
I'll take the compliment.
Okay.
Because I do value honesty and directness, and I don't know, where does that come from? Does it come from being around direct, honest people, or does it come from being around a kind of world where directness is not really
celebrated?
At the top of the list of a friend of mine said that the sort of New England culture of our youth, of my youth in the 60s, was kind of could be characterized as a culture of evasion.
Perfect.
And so if that's I do think, you know, when you're just saying direct and honest, there is a tradition, so somewhere in that, of being kind of dryly direct, sort of saying things just like they are in possibly a harsh way.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But that on the other end of that is a lot of evasive behavior. We don't talk about that. You don't express yourself if something's the matter. A lot of that. So, you know, maybe
you rebelled.
This is a reaction to that. It's like, okay, things need to be said.
Yeah, the only way to do it. And if you're a writer, I don't see how you do it any other way and make it work. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You have an eye for seeing things from a decided point of view. There's no question about it. There's a bent to your work. Emotions aren't cheap in your world, and never to be underestimated, are they?
No, I think they are. I mean, emotions are the, you know, dare I say, the things that characterize us as creatures different from all the other creatures. Mm-hmm. They're the sort of currency that binds us to one another. But they're also the currency that makes us, I won't say attack one another, but that alienates us from each other. So they're very loaded. those emotions.
Ain't that the truth?
And very perplexing and disturbing and wonderful and
fascinating.
Endlessly fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So listen to me. So you traveled to Africa like me. That's a place. That's something happens when you get to Africa. First of all, I think you get called to Africa. I've always believed that. And so your short trip turned into a longer one. And you got struck by it, whatever it is. I mean, the foreigners have a phrase, what, mal d'Afrique or something like that. But
mal d'Afrique.
I'm not real good on that. But it's true. It is absolutely, utterly true. And
for some people it is,
But let's talk about this character Jane in your book. And I brought the Africa thing up, as you probably know where I'm going with that. Not based on a real person, but maybe you. Repeatedly alluded to how alert Africa makes her, how revitalized she is to be finding herself here in a place where, quote, I'm quoting you, each step seemed to take her deeper into a true life she has not known before. First, give us a little bit of her background, because we'll play with her and then with your other main character in a second. But tell me a little bit about Jane.
Well, Jane is, the amount of background it's very subtly laid in there in the book. She comes from, a world of privilege. She's not particularly, it's not, she works for a living, and it's not like she's got sort of a free ride, but she comes from a world where things are at her fingertips, I would say. Like the sort of 10% of the planet. She's in that. And but she's not really satisfied in that place. She doesn't feel content. She's been through a traumatic marriage with an addict and is sort of in her own kind of traumatic state. And she travels to Africa, and just on the surface, just to travel to another place does things to us. It can be, if we're looking for it, make us feel new. We'll catch up with ourselves eventually, but initially there's this new feeling that of who you are without the associations that you're used to around you. And then add Africa, which I'm using. I mean, it's a continent and it's full of many, many countries. But there is in Kenya, where she goes, and Uganda, a kind of there that both welcomes the traveler, has a sort of amazing kind of display that it lays out that's not a, I was going to say not a cultural one. It's not one of cultural, accomplishments. It's one of maybe a return to something more basic in humanity and in nature and in the planet. And that strikes her and moves her in both an exhilarating way and in seeing the struggles that are very much a part of Africa, disturb her and move her in a sad way, an empathetic way.
I said revitalized, and you actually in your description make that point, that there is something very, it's vitalizing to go to Africa. I mean, because of it's raw. It's just so raw. People are so real. Everything is raw. Everything's real. And I guess what I want to ask you is the question that probably is going to make you cringe, which is, Jane is doing that. You kind of sound like you were doing that. So, that old thing about, writers write about themselves. Is that true here?
Well, I write about life that I can either convey as I've experienced it, or that I can imagine because I've experienced it. In the other character in the book is a young Ugandan girl who has been kidnapped, who has been through all these terrible things, and I write about her probably more. I mean, she's written about in the first person, so I'm going into her and telling her story when, no, I have not been a Ugandan girl who's 15.
Right.
So Jane is, yes, she has attributes much closer to my own. I wanted to have two characters who were in apparently different places and seem to be very different, and turn out
not to be so different.
Stay with them that they are not so different. Yeah.
And I'm going to take you down this road, so go with me. First of all, let me do this before we go further on that. Here are a couple of your descriptions of Africa in 30 Girls. Africa is certainly a character, as far as I'm concerned, in this book, and I'm sure you think so too. The side of the road crumbling like pie crust, a screen of haze infusing the air with a silver light, puffs rising out of the trees like dialogue bubbles from villages hidden from sight. The place so beautiful, some of the people amazing, and some of the people the very essence of evil. That in itself must have been a lot of very interesting for you to write, as well as probably even fun to convey all of that in this one world.
Well, the landscape is definitely a sort of character in this book. And that's part of, at least the Africa that I know, that is, that's very true. It's nature, and the world that you travel through is raw. It's not built up. It doesn't have layers of humans on, covering it and doing stuff to it. So that feeling that you're closer to some source, or
right,
closer to where you came from originally, is very strong there, and it can't help but affect you. And
it comes through in the work. You paint with words, but you're also a painter. I thought I'd mention that and ask if that helps your writing. And do you, in the throes of writing, sometimes scream out, "I'd rather be painting"?
Well, there's usually one little sort of surface in the many surface work spaces in my apartment where there is a paintbrush and there is paper to paint. So I usually turn to that sometimes instead of vacuuming.
I can relate.
But I think that it's probably the urge that brought me to painting, which was a response to things visually, is in me. And so I think that's just naturally a focus in my writing, because I'm interested in making sure you see what's in front of you.
And that you do. I want to go back to Jane a minute. I found this interesting, that what happened to Esther was surely not of her choice, the young Ugandan girl who'd been kidnapped. Yet what happened to Jane and how she dealt with love in her life, her disappointments, seemed to be about how she interpreted her own life events, not so much as what they really were, but how she interpreted. But to both of these women, what they felt was real. It didn't matter. Do you know what I'm saying?
Our experience of life is absolutely how we see it.
So powerful. Such a simple thing, really, when you think about it.
Yes.
Right? And yet, and I thought that the core of the book is about suffering and how we cope with our pain and how we judge our pain.
Yes.
Ourselves, and how we judge others' pain, and how others judge our pain. And I think the beauty of this, and I'll be honest, I listened to some interviews because I was interested in this book, because you know about me in Uganda. You took heat for it, and I thought it was bizarre.
Well, it's a sort of silent kind of theme in the book, is this sort of belief in a hierarchy of suffering.
Yeah, I don't think it was subtle, by the way. I think it was brilliant.
But I mean, it's not sort of addressed directly that's put forth, because I'm trying to sort of ignore that.
Yeah, right, exactly.
That way of looking at things. So you can't deny that the stakes are higher for Esther. She is, she's raped on a daily basis. She doesn't know from 1 hour to the next if she will live or die. Those things are certainly in a kind of more intense realm. But if you're not in that situation, and if you are really being vigilant about what your place is in the world and what you care about and are you doing the right thing, your, suffering for that or your search is just as valid as someone else is trying to cope with, sleeping in a ditch every night, because that's your life. We each have our lives that we're coping with. And often in, in a book, it would only be about Esther and the sort of high stakes of war, because that's much more dramatic. And we don't need to be convinced of, oh my God, this is so awful and I'm so sympathetic and what hardship. But I wanted to have Jane in there starting out with as a character that you think, wait, am I supposed to care about her when this is what's going on with Esther? And if you stick with it, I think by the end you at least recognize that they're both living life with the same quest and the same determination and the same struggle.
Well, I think it begs the question, number one, can pain be judged? Should our pain be judged? And who are we to think we can judge someone else's level of suffering?
We do it all the time.
I know.
And it's one thing because it sells short the people who are truly struggling and may not seem like it's a real struggle. But the other thing it does is when we think we're putting up on the pedestal those people who have the more extreme, in famine, in war, there's no question it's more extreme for those people. But it pushes us away from them. It says, oh my God, the phrase people use so often is, I can't imagine it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you know what? Actually, human beings are empathetic.
Most.
We have that characteristic as a species. And we do have an imagination. And actually, you can imagine it. You don't go through it, but you can imagine, because we know what it's like to feel lost. We know what it's like to feel devastated. We know what it's like to be humiliated, or all those things. And if you can put yourself in someone else's place. And I think to sort of reinforce that brings us closer together. And we don't think, oh my God, the people going through that, they're in another place. I can't even touch them. I shouldn't even try to say anything about that because it's so much more extreme.
And a couple of things that come to my mind when in the conversation of this, and that is, I think you have to assume that there's something one senses from a collective universal depth that we all share in feeling.
Yes.
And that intuition is a part of that. We can intuit what somebody else might be. That's part of empathy, I suspect, might be feeling.
Mm-hmm.
But the other side that I wanted to go with to you on this is this. When you address in this book the unspeakable horror suffered by someone like an Esther, to what place do you have to reach inside Susan, or Susan the writer, to be able to speak to that horror in words and put them on a page. That's, I bet you, half the people struggling to want to be writers would want to ask you that question.
Well, I think there are two things you have to do. One is you just picture it. You try to stay with it. You, in the same way when you're writing a scene of something, you picture every part of it, and you want to describe how everyone is behaving. And if it's a horrible thing happening, you have to do that too. So you go there, and it's like an actor. You just say, okay, if this is this, then this would be like that. And this is how it would smell. And this is what it would sound like. And this is what the action would be. And would that feel how? Would one feel shocked? Would one feel numb? Would one feel disoriented or dizzy? You know, you work it out. And then the other thing as a writer that you have to do, I think, is think of the reader and think, I want to convey this, but I don't want to, like, dump on the reader one horror after another.
Right.
Because who wants to take that in?
Right.
You know we can only take so much in. And if we're healthy, people can be empathetic, but if they have nothing to do with that empathy and they're healthy, they're going to say, I don't want to hear anymore. So I really tried in writing this book to convey some unspeakable, horrible situation without,
bombarding,
slamming the reader.
Right. And you did that so well. And I think that's instinct partly. That's talent the other. And you're firing on all cylinders at the time that you're probably in those scenes, so that you can almost watch what you're doing and saying at the same time that the character is doing whatever it is that they're saying. It's a remarkable thing to do. Did you struggle with the question, am I conveying the pain in a legitimate way? Is this responsible? Is this real?
Yeah.
Do I have a right to even interpret it?
No, I would say absolutely. I would say, it took 7 years to write, and certainly the first 3 or 4 years, I would have to make that hurdle and think, am I really? Should I really? Can I pull this off? Is this my place? Should I not? And I could argue against it, but on the other end of that argument, I had, and again, it's a very personal thing, I had those stories told to me by these girls in the most gentle, kind of accepting way. There was nothing angry. There was nothing, forceful about it. But the stories they were telling were so horrific. There was a kind of bravery in it, and there was a generosity in their telling me. And I thought, I've been, like I said before, entrusted with these stories. I'm going to try to tell them some way.
You did a good job.
And while I was writing it, I could think, this is still going on daily. I mean, I'd only think about it for 3 hours a day, but there were thousands of children living it still.
Yeah. It's a big responsibility. So Coney and company, they've left Uganda, but not before 30,000 children had been abducted by 2012. What happened to the 30 left behind, and what happened to Sister Rakali? Is that how you pronounce his name? Rakele Visera. They were all victims, and by the way, so were the families left behind.
Yeah.
That's who I interviewed, a lot of the families, traumatized beyond all. The life will never be the same. Talk to me about that.
Well, of the 30 girls, 4 of them died in captivity. So 26 eventually returned. Charlotte, the daughter of the woman at the New York dinner party who was gathering attention for the girls, was came home after, I think, 6 years with the rebels, and then the last girl returned after 12 years. The last girl of St. Mary's.
Wow.
Yeah.
And what happened to Sister?
And Sister Raquel, as far as I know, she is still there.
Okay. Got to look her up next time I'm there.
I know. I definitely do.
Yeah, me too. I'd like to talk to her.
Yeah.
One last question. You've done a boatload of interviews for this book. What's the one question that pissed you off the most? Let me think. I have to say that it's a book. Maybe it's just because I'm getting used to it by now, but I don't think it's that. I think it's the subject of the book is something that I am eager to talk about, and that's not always the case with my books. You know, I feel with the other books maybe when I wrote The Last Word, I just like to hand you the book and say no more, you know? Yep, I get that.
but with this book, there's a lot to talk about it. So I think I'm grateful for any attention that's sort of cast toward this situation.
I said you were honest. I said you were dissecting, and I said you're fearless. You just proved it, kiddo. I want to thanks.
Thank you very much.
I've been speaking with Susan Minot, author of the heart-wrenching novel based on a true story, 30 Girls, by way of Alfred A. Knopf. For more information on Susan Minot, find her on the internet. Thanks so much for tuning in to the Hallie Casser-Jayne Show, a production of Resec LLC. Associate producer, Suzanne Probst. Music by Tony Rosales Jazz. Visit HallieCasserJayne.com.